Ho 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 and happy holidays to you! Welcome to my C# Advent Calendar 2023 video. It's me, Aaron, and with me I have my Santa code reviewer, Santa Yoda. Santa Yoda, can you say hi? He says hi, I promise. To start out, Microsoft announced it's sunsetting support for Visual Studio for the Mac in 2024. This is a very large bummer for those developers that were using Visual Studio for Mac as their daily driver, and I kind of used it almost on a daily basis. I have fond memories of, over the years, to the IDE. I've been using it back even when it was called Monodevelop, went through the Xamarin Studio phase, obviously now over to Visual Studio for Mac phase, and they recently, just not too long ago, less than 2 years ago, rewrote a good portion of the UI layer to use Cocoa. It finally felt like it was coming together. Visual Studio for Mac, we're going to miss you a lot. Let's just pour one out for our friend Visual Studio for Mac. And for that, let's have a couple moments of silence. So what are our options now on the Mac? Well, as it turns out, I see we have 3 options. And those options are, 1, we talked about it last year, you can migrate to JetBrains Rider. JetBrains Rider is a great IDE, and we'll go into that in great details in a little bit. One thing you could do that you couldn't do last year is you could, technically speaking, migrate to Visual Studio Code. Now that seems like a very attractive option for some developers, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Then finally, I can't believe I'm saying this in 2023, but the third option is to run Windows somehow on your Mac, and then use Windows 11 with Visual Studio for the PC. Spoiler alert, that's not going to be a great option, but we'll go through all these. So all these options are going to cost money. There's a very good chance of this. And for that, we need to probably talk about each one of these platforms and then try to figure out which one makes a fit for you. So let's do that. To start out with, let's talk about JetBrains Rider. Anyone not living under a rock should already know about JetBrains Rider. It's a wonderful IDE provided by the fine folks at JetBrains for a fee, and you will also have to renew the license every year. Now, there is a 30-day free trial for this on their website that requires no credit card, and that to me is part of awesomeness. As a developer, if I just want to try it out, maybe I'm trying to get my company to pay for it, I don't want it to be putting my personal credit card information just to ride the IDE and try it out. So I'm really kind of happy that they offer that trial, and you, if you're not using it, you really should just pause this video, go download it, and try it out. It's pretty great. Okay, I expect you to unpause that video now. So let's go through this. Let's talk about some features and why could Rider be on Santa's nice list. So to start out with, Rider could be on Santa's nice list because it has full support for Maui projects, including XAML and Blazor projects. So let's take a look at that. I've got my IDE. Let me see if I can get that open over here and bring it over onto the window. So here's Rider, and I have it opened in a .NET 8 Maui application. It's running just fine. As you can see here, I've got my support for my debuggers. I can click this little button here. I can click the debug button. It does the things you want it to do as an IDE with Maui support with .NET 8. And that's pretty great. I've tested with Blazor projects. I don't happen to have one open, but it actually works, I think, a little bit better in Blazor. I will have to say that build times are a little slow. As you can see here, I click the build button. It does take a while. However, I really, really like the plugin system inside of Rider. It's got GitHub Copilot support. And basically, you can click on here and you can talk to GitHub. Now, the one thing I love about this is that when you ask it questions, it knows your code. So because it knows your code, when you start asking it questions, it's able to go through and give you answers basically on that code. Because it knows the context of the code, which makes the conversations when you start having it with the chat really just awesome. And this feels like just a top-notch experience for GitHub Copilot. I can't express how much I enjoy using Rider with GitHub Copilot. It feels pretty awesome. Now, with that, it also has support for Android tooling. You get the full Android device manager where you can go through and connect your physical devices. You can make your virtual devices here. And it has Log Viewer built into it. So you can go in, well, you also get your Device Explorer. Let's not forget that. That's really great when you have an app like pushed out to like an emulator, but you want to go view the file system, maybe pull the files out from the app, maybe you're looking for a log file and stuff. It does this really kind of well. And it makes sense because if you don't know this, spoiler alert, but JetBrains makes Android Studio. Android Studio, even though it's branded by Google, is just really a version of their IDE branded by Google. So it would make sense that Android over in Rider is a first-class citizen. Now, I do love the Logcat support, and it's right over here, and this gives you, if you're running an Android project, full filtering of your Logcat. It feels like native Android development. That's pretty great. And honestly, great. You can write and you can run tests, and it feels like it's built into the platform. Like testing's a first-class citizen inside of this platform. So I've got this test fixture here, and this feels pretty great. Oops, I got to plug in here, but it feels like a really great experience. Testing your app, writing your app. It's just pretty great. Now, some people are going to say, well, Aaron, that sounds great, but I'm used to the developer experience in Visual Studio for Mac, or I'm used to the experience of Visual Studio for PC, and there's things missing. Like, where's my class pull-down list, right? Maybe we should talk about why Rider could make Santa's naughty list. So there are some things in Rider that bug me as a developer. So one, the pull-down lists in the IDE were pretty great. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, at the top of Visual Studio, you get these like pull-down lists that you can pull down and get the structure of your code. And like if you want to just hop to a method real quick, those are really nice. Now, in Rider, they do have this. It's called structure, and it will give you the structure of your code over here. When you're in a XAML file, it actually goes as far as giving you the entire tree of the XAML content. In some sense, from a visual standpoint, this might be an actual upgrade from how Visual Studio handles this. Once you get used to it, of course. It's a lot of information. If you have a small laptop screen, it can get kind of daunting on a really large XAML file. But for the most part, this is actually a pretty cool experience. So it's called the structure. And it gives you you can just navigate to the certain menu item, and it's going to just automatically scroll there. You can go through and look at your XAML code then. So it may seem like that'd be on a naughty list, but I'm actually going to put that on the positive, that I think the code structure thing is a welcome change. Now, what's not a welcome change is sometimes the XAML code highlighting doesn't work at all. It just stops. And it seems like the most common thing for me is when I put a comment in. If I put a comment in my code, which I need to do from time to time, the color highlighting just completely breaks. It seems like I have to then fiddle around with things just to get the code highlighting to work again. And for me, a lot of times that's just really aggravating. I like to use the code highlighting to make sure that I've closed my quotes, for example, or I've closed a tag. I'm using the visual aspects of the IDE because of the fact I want it to help me make sure my code is not broke. And when the highlighting and stuff doesn't work, it feels like a pretty big negative against it. And so I want to put that's the first thing that could make a Rider go on Santa's naughty list. Now, the second thing I'd have to say that really makes it feel like it could go on Santa's naughty list is support for other mobile platforms. We live in a world where Maui and Blazor aren't the only gig in town. And it turns out there's platforms like Uno and Avalonia, and they're really great platforms. On my recent .NET Lunch stream, plug for the .NET Lunch stream, you can watch it here on YouTube. Just go to my playlist and look for that. Uno was a nightmare on Rider. I'm going to be honest with you. I used the command line tool to make my project, but still just getting everything working with Uno and Rider on a Mac just felt like a level of super jank and frustration. Over on PC land, in Visual Studio for PC, they have a special plugin for it, and building a project was actually kind of enjoyable. And Uno as a platform is pretty cool. Now, is this Rider's fault or Uno's fault? Well, I think it's a little bit of both, because to get that kind of hardcore integration experience, Rider would need to work with Uno. And I've talked to the people at Uno, and my understanding is they worked pretty hard on this with Microsoft to make that Uno experience pretty awesome. Rider needs to step up their game and work with some more of the open source community on these .NET projects to make the experience of using Uno or Avalonia better. Because right now, if you're on one of those platforms, especially hardcode Uno developers, I don't think Rider is the choice for you on a Mac. I think it's probably best that you would be using like Visual Studio 2022 on a PC or Visual Studio Code, and I'll get into some of that stuff in a little bit. Now, the final thing that really kind of also makes me want to put Rider on Santa's naughty list is support for the latest .NET frameworks and for the latest versions of Xcode. Rider always seems like they're a step behind. Microsoft always promised 0-day support in Visual Studio for the Mac. It's one of the reasons I really liked it a lot. It was guaranteed that that day that the new iOS version drops and Apple requires a new version of Xcode, it was just going to work. I could count on the patch coming from Microsoft, and within 48 hours, I knew that my application I'd written in .NET was going to be able to run on all these latest versions of these devices. And for big companies where people get excited about buying phones and going on new platforms, it's kind of important. And so not having 0-day support, and like literally we just now got .NET 8 support for Rider, and that was like a month after it was released. And the EAP version was really, really kind of buggy. So you can't tell me that that's the solution to this. They know Apple gives you 6 months for Xcode betas. They don't change it after the release candidates. You have plenty of time to find support for Xcode, in my opinion. I'm a developer. I understand this, right? And this isn't like it just comes and drops out of nowhere. Every year, there's a new version of Xcode. Every year, there's a new version of .NET. We are developers, and we know, like clockwork, when that's going to happen. Really, they should be adjusting their backlog to make sure that they drop right after, and they should be having enough testing where they feel confident about that. And this makes me feel like Rider is like an afterthought project at JetBrains, and that part makes me sad because I really wish the support was better for it, because I do think it's possibly the best solution on this list. Now, next on our list is something that I didn't bring up last year all that much because of the fact that it wasn't really a viable option, and that's VS Code. What? VS Code has somehow made my list in 2023? Yeah, it has, actually, and that's pretty cool. Now, the reason why it has is that they've recently added not one, but 2 plugins to it. And the one plugin is called the C# Dev plugin, which is kind of kicking in, and I have to admit, is a little janky, but does work. And you can see here kind of just format my project and change me to what they call a different view, a solution view, which is cool. Okay. And they also have a plugin for .NET. So Visual Studio Code now has the full suite of .NET support for backend building applications, front-end building with whatever you want. And with Maui support and Blazor support, this is a kind of almost good option. Now, I need to point out that while this all seems like it's the perfect world, I need to pull out and talk about the thing that makes this a little confusing. Most people don't know this, but the C# Dev Kit requires a license. And you can see here, there's a big step, kind of like a stipulation about this on Microsoft's website about what it requires to be a license, which doesn't. And this gets it's confusing if you ask me, right? For personal, academic, and open source projects, the dev kit can be used at no cost. For commercial purposes, for teams up to 5 can use the dev kit for no cost. For developers 6+ that use, they'll need to buy a professional or higher subscription. So dev kit is also included in GitHub Codespace's Microsoft DevBox. So users of those products have access to it. It's like these are a lot of rules you have to kind of take a look at, and if you're confused about like what you sit on with these rules, you may have to go talk to your IT shop and find out, can you even use this, or do you need a license? And that license might be expensive. So most people think Visual Studio Code is for free. Not 100% true with this extension. You have to really understand the licensing. And that is probably my number one thing that makes it go onto the Santa's naughty list, is that this should be easier for people. They had a Visual Studio Community Edition license for years. It should just be like, hey, the license works just like Visual Studio Community. Go read the Visual Studio Community license. Just incorporate the same license. Why make this so hard? But then the Maui plugin also is available here, and this is the website to Maui. It's pretty great. But the Maui plugin also has some other rules in it, and you need to kind of make sure you understand those rules. For example, in .NET Maui, they only support .NET 7 or higher. So if you're in .NET 6 and you have an older Maui application, this isn't going to work. And it does require that C# Dev Kit, which means you're going to have all the Visual Studio licensing and IntelliCode subscription here you can see here as a requirement. Obviously, it's pretty obvious that you need to have the Android SDK, and for building for iOS and Mac requires Xcode. That's pretty much there. The limitations also is something before we even start talking about the nice and naughty list is out there. You need to understand that it's pretty lightweight. It's kind of beta right now. IntelliSense doesn't work that great, and there is zero hot load support. Now, can't really call that against Visual Studio Code, but because JetBrains Rider doesn't really have hot reload support either, and it just doesn't work. So if you're saying that if you want hot reload support and you had it in Visual Studio for Mac, it's a sad day for you because neither one of these solutions have that. Now, why could Visual Studio Code make the Santa's nice list? You know, there is things out there. It seems like I'm talking all negative, but there's things that are pretty nice about it. So one, it's pretty lightweight and easy to use. Now, I'm going to put an asterisk by that when I say that it's lightweight and easy to use because that's kind of true, but kind of not true. But the IDE does work. It's pretty nice. It's easy to see your code. It has a ton of extensions built into it. It's so many extensions that it can be a little daunting how many extensions you could plug into Visual Studio Code to make your development life easier. Now, one thing I'll say is that there's multiple ways to view your code. So on the nice list, they do give you, here's this one view that is kind of like a generic view of it. You could just basically go into the outline and get the outline view of your class. I was talking about that earlier. That's kind of like the structure in JetBrains Rider, which is pretty cool. But they also give you like the old school Visual Studio solution support view, where you're just going to get this as a solution support, which means you're going to get here's your XAML file. And then if you browse underneath it, that's your XAML file and your code behind file. I prefer this view. I feel like this is really close to Visual Studio's view. And this is a really nice way to view your stuff. And I think the color syntax highlighting works better in VS Code than it does in Rider. I think the color theme that it uses and just the editor experience feels a little bit more fluid, a little bit better in VS Code than it does in Rider. The final thing I'll say is once you get used to the IDE, it seems pretty cool. Now, why could it make Santa's naughty list? Because really, I kind of pointed out some really great things about it. One, the experience, once you get used to it, of like using the Solution Explorer and stuff, feels very much like Visual Studio for Mac felt. The IDE feels more nimble. It feels like it's kind of almost better supported, and it kind of is, right? Because it's just so much more popular. There's a ton of extensions. Visual Studio for Mac had no extensions for the most part. There's a couple out there. VS Vim ran wonderful on VS for Mac, and thank you very much for Jared and a couple other developers that worked on that for so long to get support. It was really great. Pour another one out for Visual Studio for Mac. But basically over here, it really is a very vibrant ecosystem. It doesn't feel like it's going to get dropped by Microsoft anytime soon. Knock on wood. All right. So then what is it that I would say maybe is a little bit that could put it on the naughty list? And so the one thing that really kind of bugs me is the debugging experience, and even like the testing experience is poor. They give me this run button, right? But nothing's here. It seems kind of weird that there's nothing there. And in the directions, you have to follow them pretty close to a shell that there's this whole thing about like figuring out like how to even debug your app. And if you have your toolbar down here, which is #hint, if you right click on it, you get all these options. If you have too many options in the toolbar, you're gonna miss the actual toolbar icon you need to debug, which is this little icon right here that lets you select which platform you want to target for debugging and how to debug. It's not over here in this window. Why do you have this really weird toolbar icon over here or in the command window, this command palette window, which is also super confusing with just way too many options inside of it? Why do I have to, it's not a great developer experience. So if you don't see this little like squiggly brackets here when you open a XAML file and you want to debug, and it changes if you have a C# file, you're going to see here that instead of XAML, it says C#. This little thing right here is how you debug, how to set up the debugger. That to me feels like it's like in the middle of nowhere and kind of weird. And then if I want, I can click on this and you can see here, it'll say auto detect, but I'm going to change. If I click on the little like brackets here, squiggly brackets, I'm going to say debug target. And this will give me my ability to debug like on my iPhone simulator, on my iPad, on my Android, and right now it sees my Android emulator. So it shows all the target platforms that are available in this Maui app, and it allows me to then debug on one of those based on what it sees available and installed. That's really cool. I think that is cool, but to find it and like the experience of like this debug thing over here doesn't work, and it works different in Maui than it does with other kind of technologies like Node and stuff. It just feels weird. Now, I don't feel like also it's sometimes not stable. And that's the last thing I want to kind of bring up for why it could be on the naughty list. Sometimes the debug just doesn't do anything, and I have to close Visual Studio Code and reopen it. And I know that some of you are going to say, well, Aaron, that used to happen to me in Visual Studio for the Mac all the time. I used to have to sometimes close and reopen it. I get that, but over in Rider, it's pretty rock solid. And so anytime I have to close the IDE and like, you know, reopen it and get all my toolbar windows, it's just like, feels like it's a backwards experience. They do say that this is a first version, and they fully admit that it's not, they don't say experiment in the word, but it feels a little experimental. So that you got to kind of go in there with that. And also, it's not free. In a Visual Studio license, it's kind of expensive. So, I mean, Rider is considerably cheaper than Visual Studio Professional as a license if you just go look for it. So, Visual Studio Code, if you require a license, is it the thing you should use? I think you need to try out both of them yourself and take a look at that, because I'm not 100% convinced that Visual Studio Code, at least in its current iteration, is the best Maui solution. So let's take a look at our third option, our option that I can't even believe I'm talking about in 2023. But let's talk about running Windows 11 on your Mac and then using Visual Studio for Windows as a solution. Yep, it's 2023, and this feels like a ridiculously step backwards. And it's kind of against all the messaging Microsoft used to put out about on the Mac, we're going to have this first class experience, Visual Studio for the Mac. We're going to make it so that if you're a developer on this platform, you have all these options. You don't have to run virtual machines. And now they're kind of backtracking and say, well, just run Visual Studio or Windows and Visual Studio. This is not great. Now, there's a couple reasons why this could make Santa's nice list. And I'm not going to lie. Visual Studio for Windows is the best .NET developer experience. As a person that did .NET before any of these options were available on the Mac, I've been using .NET since 2001 when it came out, and I've been using Visual Studio ever since then. I don't use it that much anymore on the PC, at least, because the last 5 or 6 years I've had all these other options on the Mac. But Visual Studio on the PC, it feels like going home a little bit when you use it. If you're used to it, you have all these cool things like the pull down menus I was telling you about earlier are there. They give me all my ability to just go quickly to things. That feels kind of great. Browsing the ID feels like I've went home. And if you've used Visual Studio for the PC, it feels pretty great. I like Visual Studio for PC because it supports every feature that Microsoft has. Hot reload supported. What? Yeah, it's not supported on the other two, but it's supported here. That's kind of nice. Hot reload saves so much time. And it's a real bummer that it doesn't work on Visual Studio for Code and Rider. And sometimes I feel like I waste so many cycles waiting for an app to rebuild. And compared to like native development in Swift or Android, all those cycles, you never feel that. Their hot reload experience is top notch over in Xcode and Android land. So it just feels better here. And Visual Studio for PC feels kind of polished because it is. It's old. It's been around forever. And so because of that, it just is pretty great. They have a lot of extensions you can install, kind of like Rider and VS Code. So the extension store is pretty great. And just using it for writing code specifically feels nice. Now, why could this solution make Santa's naughty list? And there's a lot. Let me just go through this real quickly so I can recap, because it's slow. I mean, it's a virtual machine and it takes a lot of resources, and most people don't have a lot of memory on a Mac. The default Mac Mini and MacBook Air come with 8 gigabytes of RAM. You're now telling me you're going to run the full Windows 11 operating system and Visual Studio, 2 really heavy things to run? And that's the solution, is run these in an emulator? This beefy hardware not a lot of people can afford. Also, you have to buy a Windows 11 license on top of this. If you just have a Mac, you don't have a Windows 11 license, so now you need something to run Windows 11 in. You're going to have to pay for Parallels or try to hack together some open source solution like QEM, which kind of works, but also you're going to have to support that. If it breaks, you're going to have to fix it. That's not fun. That goes against your time development because now you're trying to manage this solution. You have, like I said, you have to get the Windows 11 license, and then you have to get a Visual Studio license on top of that, right? Now, of course, there is Community Edition, and if you meet the requirements of Community Edition, that's free. But for some of us, that's not free, and that's just something else you have to start taking a look at. And when you look at the price of Visual Studio, I kind of said that over in VS Code land, the professional license is extremely more expensive than Rider. Now, if you're on an M series processor, it gets even worse because this is ARM. And that means that you're on an ARM processor for your M series. And that means you have to run the Windows 11 ARM edition. Nothing else in Windows is done for ARM. The ARM experience is terrible today. 99% of the apps run on x86, which means they're going to run even slower because you're already emulating Windows on here. And now I'm running like GitHub Desktop. Guess what? That's an x86 app. So that's running with emulation on top of it. So everything feels like all your developer tools outside of Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code on Windows 11 are almost all x86. Nobody's jumped on the ARM bandwagon right now, and that's sad on that part, but that's partially Microsoft's fault for not making it more a prevalent thing to do like Apple does with the M series and get support for that. But because of the fact that ARM just isn't out there, you load this Windows PC with a couple other pieces of software that you like to use during development lifecycle, the whole thing just feels janky and slow. And it's expensive hack, like I said. You just need so much stuff. Now finally, and I have to point this out, using the build host in 2023 feels like 5 steps backwards. And so the build host, if you don't know it, for Maui and Uno and pretty much any of those development platforms, if you need to build the code on PC and run it like on an iOS simulator, you have to run this thing called the build host, which means you have to still have a Mac. They have to talk to each other through the network. It pushes code back and forth. It's slow. It is way slower building your application than if you build it in Rider on the Mac natively or VS Code. And this thing breaks like way too much. It feels like I went back in a time machine to 2016 or 2015, back when I used to use Visual Studio for a short period of time for Xamarin development and fighting the build host and seeing why my simulators don't show up or why they disappear or why even though I click the debug button, they don't show up in here. This happens, and I've only been using it for about 3 weeks. It happened to me a dozen times. And so the hot reload support, well, I felt like that was really great. The build host stuff feels so janky that it kind of wiped out the positive of the hot reload. And it got to the point where I found myself moving back to Rider or VS Code way more because of the fact that they were just more stable than the solution. And finally, this is also kind of weird to state, but and it's going to get into the next section I want to do at my stocking stuffers. Maui in Windows isn't great. Like when you build and you select Windows as the platform for Maui specifically, you have to really work hard to make the Windows app even remotely look good. The weird thing is that the Mac Catalyst app, and I know why, because Catalyst is just basically another version of iOS. The Mac Catalyst app is actually pretty easy to make look plausible as a Mac application. I actually found it really easy with just tweaking just a couple little XAML values to make it look pretty decent. But man, the story for WinUI and doing that in Maui on Windows is it's a lot of work to make my app that I've been working on look decent there. And there's a lot of rendering bugs and just a lot of things where it feels like it's really unpolished. Almost to the point where it's like, would people even use this? I almost have gotten to the point where an app I'm building, I'm like, pull Windows support and tell them to use Android because I know that you can run Android apps on Windows now because it's not even worth my time fixing because it's so clunky and just out of the box, it looks so terrible. So that's my kind of assessment of Rider, VS Code, and Visual Studio running inside of some kind of virtual machine on the Mac. Now, which one should you pick? Well, it's going to be kind of up to you. My recommendation is that you try all 3 of them. You see how much they cost, you do an analysis of that, and then you make the decision based on what works in your workflow. For me, I'm going to be sticking with Rider, and I'll probably continue using VS Code and keep an eye on that. And if it gets better and gets hot reload support, I may seriously think about switching over to that. I do own a personal Visual Studio license, so for me, the license is really not an issue. It's more of, I feel like VS Code still has got a little jank in it. And Rider seems to be the build process and stuff. I'm faster to debug than I am in VS Code right now. That's just my personal experience based on my hardware and stuff. It may differ for you, so that you like I said, you need to kind of go through and do your homework. But I do find, funnily enough, that I tend to build my app first in Mac Catalyst on Rider, get it looking great there, then go to phone, make it look great on iOS, and then Android last. And I feel like Maui on Android has gotten really good. And .NET 8, it's really way better than it's ever been before. I want to thank you again for spending time with me. I want to hope that all you have a wonderful, safe, and happy holidays. A happy new year. Go check out the C# event calendar. There's so much better content than my content out there, quite honestly. Upgrade your knowledge. It's free, and that's the power of it. And if you like .NET, come over to my channel. I've got a lunch stream I do almost every day. Obviously, with the holidays up here, I haven't been streaming the last couple of days because things are busy. But I do have a .NET lunch stream that I stream live on YouTube and on Twitch. And I do some random streaming at night also with .NET and with other platforms. So go ahead and hang out over there. Either way, thank you for attending, and I'll see you guys in the next video.